Meet our plenary leader for today as we gather together to explore the language of faith formation. While working the night shift as a grocery store checker, she was held up at gunpoint. She has traveled on 6 of the 7 continents and is a previous world record holder in leapfrog. Please welcome Lisa Kimball.
It's all true. It is such a privilege to be with you today. When I was invited to be here and to be part of this conference as a plenary speaker, my heart leapt, and I continue to be just reminded that we are one family, one body in Christ, and what a joy that is. So thank you. Ho, everyone who thirsts, come to the waters. When I heard that that was the theme, the first story that struck me was a memory long ago when I lived in San Francisco. And I lived there with a lovely dog who had adopted me, you know, one of those strays that finds its way into your life. And there should be a slide of a dog fairly soon. You'll get this idea. But here she was, Millie, and we moved right into the city. And the very first afternoon that I had a chance to go to the beach with Millie, I thought, I'm going to do it. I piled her into my car. We drove over. If you know the San Francisco Peninsula, the west side of the city is facing the Pacific. And you know, it's cliffs. This is not actually Millie, and this is not actually San Francisco, but it's a great picture. But imagine a more brindled dog that was much more of a mutt. Imagine a much rockier beach, but it's the same concept, right? Dogs love to play. So we get to the beach. I pull into a parking spot. I barely had the door open. She squirmed out, and she just started to run for the ocean. Now that meant running over the edge of a cliff that I'd never climbed over. It meant finding a trail, which she did, and running down that trail, getting to the rocky beach, leaping over these rocks she'd never seen before. And I'm trying to keep up with her, not worried that I'd lose her, but curious about her enthusiasm. And she had it. And she ran out there into those wonderful waves, ran, and put her head in the water and took a big drink. And then all sorts of strangeness came across her face. And she came out of the water very bedraggled, a little like Piper on that first clip. And she came up to me with these big eyes, sort of like, Mom, what have you done? And I had a bedraggled, befuddled, very misled dog. I tell you that story because it's a cautionary tale for me. People are thirsty. Dogs are thirsty. It really matters what we drink, and it really matters as church leaders what kind of water we offer. So, the title, The Language of Faith Formation. There's a "the" at the beginning, right? There's this article in the beginning of that little phrase, and I just want to quickly say that we have to be careful about that term. It could get us in trouble. It might suggest a form of ethnocentrism. It might suggest that there's a one-size-fits-all way to do faith formation that does not consider your cultural context. It might consider a theological exclusivism, that perhaps my doctrinal language is better than yours. It might suggest a pedagogical rigidity, the way we teach and learn. It might assume who is the expert. It might make assumptions about how people learn. It might, in some ways, narrow what we actually are about. That's not the language of faith formation we're going to be talking about. For me, the language of faith formation is the lived practices of the people of God, through which beliefs and traditions are communicated and transmitted, lifelong, life-wide, and life-deep. Parker Palmer, the wise Quaker educator, reminds us often that teaching is a very complex art, that it is more than subject matter and technique. Do you remember the phrase he uses? We teach who we are. What and how we teach emerges from one's own inwardness. We project the condition of our very own souls onto the students and to the subject that we teach, and to our way of being together. As Christians, and certainly as Christian educators, as formation leaders, youth ministers, pastors. You and I are teachers. We are teachers of the faith, and the condition of our souls and of our own spiritual practices matters. As we rapidly approach 2025, the quarter century mark, if you can believe that, it is not news to any of you that the world in which we live and in which our souls are drinking is changing. Demographics are changing rapidly. Political boundaries, Brexit, climate change, flooding, drought. It's not news to any of you that the world in which we live is hurting. Wars, famine, refugees, natural disasters, racism, fear, polarization, economic disparity, healthcare and education that's out of reach for many people. It's not news to any of you that the American religious landscape is shifting and drifting. Pew publishes regular graphs and articles about latest research. The nuns, the duns, religious decline, and all the rigorous debates about secularization, the pros about Charles Taylor's theories and the cons. Generational faith transmission is challenging and uncertain. Is it any surprise that once mainline Protestant churches such as yours and mine are filled with anxiety and uncertainty? Busy, busy places focused on survival. This pie chart, which was created by a friend and a colleague, Kyle Oliver, puts in a visual form the dramatic changes of our religious affiliation in this country between 1948 and 2017. It's pretty dramatic. So some of our congregations, some of the churches we love and we have loved for years are shrinking. Some of them have more empty pews or empty chairs. Some of them are closing. Some of them are consolidating. Some budgets are being cut. Many are overly focused on the latest techniques in a desperate and sincere effort to thrive. Too many congregations, in my opinion, are living in denial about the changes around them, or are isolated by their tight grip on a particular expression of their tradition, or of what they think is beautiful. But look around this room. There are 700 or so of us here. And your determination, the support of your congregations, your families, your judicatories, your schools, your seminaries, and the grace of God have made this conference and your participation in it possible. You are actually here because you know that faith has the capacity to hope, as the ability to find and make meaning, grounds our awareness of self, others, and God. You are aware of a bigger world. You are aware of God, life-wide. So we are Christians, and I believe we are made for a time just like this. As Paul declared to the Romans, and you know this well, therefore we have been buried with him by baptism into death, so that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of God, so we too might walk in newness of life. We're made new for a time just like this. Or as the writer of Hebrews so eloquently says, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, who for the sake of the joy that was set before him endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of God. We are Christians, and we have been made new for a time just like this. Some would say that our faith is being tested, and indeed it is. But I choose to see it a little differently. My faith matters more to me than it ever has. I see it as a privilege and an opportunity that I cannot take my Christian identity for granted, that I cannot assume that the people around me speak the same language, that the images and metaphors of faith that I grew up with make any sense at all to the person next to me in the grocery store. I am filled with optimism with all that surrounds us. And much as the author of Isaiah 55 said in the foundational text for this conference, much as that writer is addressing thirsty, hungry people who had been long in exile and recently returned to Jerusalem, where the city had not yet been rebuilt and social and economic structures were fragile, just like that, I believe that we are called to proclaim good news today. And the text in Isaiah is much more than an invitation to come and drink and make merry. It's actually a command. The verbs are in the imperative in the Hebrew. It's a proclamation of salvation and good news at a time when the people most desperately need it. Like my dog Millie, the salt water of our times is making people more thirsty for living water, more hungry for good news. My vocation, and I believe yours, is to practice the language of faith formation right now, and the call could not be more clear or more urgent. I'm optimistic because our God has not changed. Our God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. I'm optimistic because the promise of salvation that Jesus brought to us in his life, death, and resurrection, that hasn't changed. I'm optimistic because we do, in fact, have resources for a time just like this. We've inherited centuries of rich theology and ministerial practice that can shape the work of passing on faith. We're also the beneficiaries of extensive research today in the teaching and learning, in neuroscience, in cognitive psychology, in ethnography, sociology, linguistics, and so much more. We know more about what it is to live human than any people of any time have ever known. And out of necessity and limited material resources, American churches are waking up and becoming more honest about what hasn't worked. Now that our once mainline denominations can no longer hide behind the facade of a Christian empire, they are also free to choose life. We are free to become the beloved community that God envisions. I'm seeing innovation, and you probably are too, and spiritual revival in congregations of all size and shapes across this country. And many of them are participating in a grant initiative that I'm leading right now called Baptized for Life. There's serious interest in prayer, in meditation, in Bible study, in ministry collaborations, in getting outside of their buildings. Tiny congregations are taking big risks, and large congregations are slowing down to go deeper. I've seen in my own goddaughter a move from 10 years of homelessness to housing, and now being very close to graduating from high school, because my congregation and I slowed down and committed to walk beside her prayerfully one day at a time. So I am hopeful. I'm hopeful not in trends and all of the statistics, but I'm hopeful in the data points, those specific pieces of information that actually make all those trends possible. John Adams once said that facts are stubborn things. Well, so are miracles, and we have a lot of them to claim. And hope is my personal reaction to the reality when I pay close attention to what God is actually doing. C.S. Lewis has his lovely quote, "I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." My challenge and yours is twofold. The language of faith formation, the radical good news that we are loved and we are forgiven, that death has lost its sting, is not getting through all the noise of fear and oppression, noise of violence and greed and hatred and partisanship. Too many people are still desperately thirsty. And as Richard Rohr wrote in a blog, too often we, the church, have put the unconverted in charge of conversion. We've asked good people whose own faith experience is not yet that deep to lead other people in programs and ministries. We've expected them to draw from wells that are not full. And what does that do? It means they feel that they are a fraud, they feel insecure about their confidence and their knowledge of the truth and the faith, and the people who are following them can only go so far. So we have work to do, we who are leaders and we who are followers. If the language of faith formation is in fact the lived practices of the people of God, through which beliefs and tradition are communicated lifelong, life-wide, and life-deep, then fluency, fluent faith formation language, depends on your and my active participation in those practices, always listening for the will of God, always in discernment, and together growing in our deeper understanding of how God is moving in the world. It's not something we can do in 1 hour a week on Sunday morning. It's something that has to be built in to our daily life and the rhythms and order of how we live. What we say and what we do individually and corporately in response to God's generous invitation really, really matters. So it's not enough for us to just sign the membership rolls. It's not enough for just give our money. It's not enough. Those are good practices. They are wonderful practices, but they don't change my heart. What changes my heart is being immersed in communities of faith, immersed in practices of study and prayer and risk. Faith formation, which for us is actually Christian formation, is more than programs targeted at age groups or interest groups that rely heavily on schooling models of teaching and learning. To be very clear, there are places, and this conference is a good example, where classes led by trained people who are qualified to teach us are really important. But what's so important about that model of teaching is that the people who are learning have chosen to learn, and on topics that are relevant and current and appropriate to their particular thirst at that particular time. Just having Sunday school, confirmation class, maybe an adult forum, a midweek Bible study, if we're lucky, a Lenten program, those programmatic chunks are valuable, but they're not enough. Faith formation has to be understood to be lifelong, life-wide, and life-deep. It's a process of discipleship. It is never done. And it's actually Christian education on steroids. Faith formation is 24/7, 365. It happens in our dreams. It happens when we're pouring cereal in the morning. It happens when we're frustrated in the car and somebody cut us off. Our faith is constantly in formation. So the question for me is, to what extent are we actually living as if we expect to encounter God every moment in every dimension of our lives? All the time. Let's break that down a bit. Faith formation is lifelong. As living species, we are, and you know this, programmed by our DNA to grow. We participate in our development. We engage our environment, and it's impacted by what's happening around us. Biologists call all of this series of interactions between species and environment epigenetics. Sociologists call this the life course perspective. Two people born in the same place at the same time may have very different life experiences because of the events that interrupt their natural biological development. Theologically, we believe that God created each of us in the image of God, with unique gifts for ministry. Becoming fully the Imago Dei is a lifelong process, nurtured by the body of Christ, that will never be complete in this world. Remember Paul's words, "For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part, then I will know fully, even as I have been known fully." We are, in fact, hardwired for transcendence. God is a magnet, pulling us ever closer into an I-thou relationship. And that tug is what you and I experience as longing, as thirst, as desire. As Augustine of Hippo wrote now famously in his Confessions, "Thou hast made us for thyself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it finds its rest in thee." Earlier this year, researchers at Columbia and Yale universities confirmed Augustine's 4th century claim. They isolated the place in our brains that spiritual experiences are activated. They explain how they generated personally relevant spiritual experiences in a diverse group of subjects and scanned their brains while their experiences were happening. The results indicate that there is, in fact, a neurobiological home in our brains for spirituality. When we feel a sense of connection with something greater than the self, whether transcendence as we define it involves communion with God, nature, or humanity, a certain part of our brain is activated by that mysterious encounter. That's really good news, folks. And to that scientific discovery, the demographic reality that is true across the globe is that we're living longer. The fastest growing demographic across the world, do you know who they are? The old. People who are 85 and older are growing faster for reasons of better nutrition generally, for reasons of better health care generally, for reasons of better education generally. We are living longer. So if we're living longer and we have a brain that can and does respond to spirituality, we have a lifelong responsibility as church to nurture that capacity. Faith formation has to be lifelong, but it also has to be relevant. In many churches that I know, adult education is kind of a one-size-fits-all. If you self-identify as an adult, you can go, but you might be 24 and you might be 97. And I don't know a lot of 24-year-olds who have exactly the same hunger and thirst as 97-year-olds. So lifelong doesn't mean, oh, we just do more of the same for the longer generations. It really means listening to where God is active in people's lives here and now. Life from faith formation is also life-wide. It is learning to recognize and honor the glory of God in our everyday lives and throughout creation. I call this becoming attentive to the ordinary and turning on my peripheral vision. It's beginning to notice the little things, the things that are right here, right now. In John 1, we were reminded that all things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. So through God and in Christ, all things were created. I try to remember that when there are things I bump into that I'm not that excited about, like the 4 ticks I found on my dog yesterday after a deep freeze. But they are creatures of God. They too were created. Or in Psalm 33, where it says, "He loves righteousness and justice. The earth is full of the steadfast love of the Lord." Do we see it? Do we really see that God is everywhere in the earth around us? Or this passage from Job 12, "But ask the animals, and they will teach you." Why do we love animated movies about animals? Or all the Facebook posts about animals, right? Ask the animals, they will teach you. The birds of the air, and they will tell you. Ask the plants of the earth, and they will teach you. And the fish of the sea will declare to you. Who among all of these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? In his hand is the life of every living thing and the breath of every human being. God is all around us. And when we notice life-wide, our faith is changed. So how are we equipping people to walk through life alert, expectant, open? Are we praying at home? Are we praying at work? Are we praying on the bus, in the playground? Do people even know how to pray? Do we really listen to strangers? Are we actually befriending someone from that other political party? Are we fostering caring conversations with neighbors? Do we cross lines of difference? Are we noticing the sacred online? Are we being a blessing online? What's the tone of your post? If life-wide faith formation is the incarnation, then life deep is experiencing the transcendent God. Slowing down, making time and space for silence. Silence in our dominant culture today is a radical alternative. The noise, the white noise, the constant motion is not space where many of us find silence. So choosing it, building it in, is its own radical practice. Psalm 46, verse 10 is what I have on my screen as my screensaver at work. Be still and know that I am God. And whenever that comes across my screen, I've come to the practice of sitting and stopping and breathing and remembering and thanking God. Like Elijah, life-deep faith formation is learning to listen for the still small voice of God, perhaps through regular practice of contemplative prayer. Perhaps it's yoga. Perhaps it's walking. Perhaps it's deep breathing. Perhaps for some of you, it's running. It's learning to notice the places where your body is yearning to be still. If we're privileged to have a smartwatch, we need to start taking seriously those reminders to stand up and stretch, those reminders to breathe. We need to be immersed in Scripture, not read it quickly intellectually, but let it just dwell in us and around us. If we can meet with a spiritual director. We can establish what I call a spiritual habitus online. How do we use our digital technologies and our platforms in the service of good rather than be victim to them and be constantly attached to them? How do we proclaim good news and find space in them to be with God in the digital world? How do we develop a personal rule of life so that it is yours, not something someone else imposes? If the language of faith formation is the lived practices of the people of God through which beliefs and tradition are communicated and transmitted, lifelong, life-wide, and life-deep, how do we as leaders simultaneously build our own fluency and the fluency of others? How do we grow ourselves while we are nurturing the faith of other people? I think it's pretty simple. I think it's by being the church we're called to be. Maria Harris, who may be familiar to many of you who have studied religious education, was a Roman Catholic religious educator. And she wrote a real watershed book back in 1989 called Fashion Me a People, Curriculum in the Church. In this book, she offered a way forward. She proposed that forming faith, fashioning a people into who God made us to be, is actually the vocation of the whole church. It's not just the job of the Sunday school teacher or the youth minister or the pastor. It's everyone. So we as pastors, as Christian education directors, as youth ministers, as family ministers, as parents and confirmation leaders, we cannot fall into the temptation of doing this work alone. We are called as church not to be the experts, but to be the midwives who provide support, care, and counsel as people of all ages claim their new life in Christ. Just last month, I heard Anglican theologian Rowan Williams put it this way. He said, in his very British accent behind all the hair, he said, "Remember, the mission of the whole church is to form people to be able to receive the gifts that God has for them and for the world. Remember that the mission of the whole church is to form people to be ready to receive the gifts that God has for them and for the whole world." I think that's lovely. Maria Harris wrote, "The church does not have a curriculum. It is a curriculum. The church itself, the assembly, we all are educators together, teaching to and through various forms to shape us into the people God has made and is making." So before you think that that sounds lovely or duh, yeah, that's, of course, that's what we've always heard, and that it isn't terribly practical, Let's talk about what she really meant. She says there are 5 dimensions of curriculum that all of us as church can be and are practicing. And that if we recognize each of them as interconnected fabric of this formation initiative, we will in fact form the people of God as God wants us to form them. Now she used Greek terms. So her 5 practices were koinonia, community, liturgia, worship or prayer, kerygma for proclamation, didache for teaching, and diakonia for service. Think about your congregation. Those are 5 principal areas of work and ministry in your life as church, right? Christian formation doesn't just happen in Sunday school. It happens whenever and wherever the people of God live into their vocation. So that means it's happening in all of these areas of our common life. And all we have to do to enrich the formation is begin to bring people's attention to the particulars, to reflect on why we do it the way we do it. Why have we always done this? What does it mean? What's happening to your body while it's happening? Are you noticing new things? What could we change up so that we notice it differently? If you introduce a new hymn or a new prayer, people's ears perk up. What does that do? That enlivens for us the possibility of what God is doing. So we need to welcome the Holy Spirit into these areas of our church life and be sure that others notice with us. For those of you who have studied church history, you will recognize that Maria Harris didn't make this up out of thin air herself. She was drawing from a much more ancient pattern of Christian discipleship called the catechumenate. How many of you, just show of hands, have heard of the catechumenate? Look at you, well-formed people. Put them up again, wave your hands. I teach in a seminary, and there's a lot of seminarians who've never heard of the catechumenate, so you do well, that's great. But here's the thing, according to Hippolytus's apostolic tradition in the 3rd century, adult converts to the Christian faith were presented to teachers by people who could vouch for those adult converts, and then the converts entered into a 3-year process of preparation for baptism. 3 years. Isn't it interesting? Fast forward to 2019. 3 years is the magic number that you're supposed to go to traditional seminary to be ordained. And maybe 10 minutes is the magic time you're prepared for baptism in some congregations. We've kind of flipped the equation. So according to Hippolytus, this process was introduced, and the early church understood that the lived practices of the people of God communicate beliefs and tradition. The best way for someone who wanted to become Christian to become like us was to live with us, to engage with us in what we do. So they immersed these inquirers in immersive, incredible experience of church. So it's much like going to summer camp or going to Hogwarts, where everything you do is making you a better wizard, right? So if you think about your church, if a stranger walks in off the street, does everything you do make them a better Christian yet? I'm guessing maybe not, because a lot of it is kind of mysterious. When we stand, when we sit, who goes up to the front, who doesn't, what those big words mean. There's a lot of gap between who I am as a visitor, a seeker, a hungry, thirsty person, and what actually may happen. But the early church understood. We learn by experience. So it scooped up these inquirers. It gave them a sponsor. So inquirers were welcomed. They were shown generous hospitality. They were assigned a person who was a little further along on the journey of faith. That's all koinonia. That's Christian community at its best. Then that person became active in the life of the church. That person then was invited into worship, experienced the music, experienced the prayers. That's liturgia, kerygma, proclamation, sermons, teaching. And then they were introduced intimately to Holy Scripture. They sat with each other and with their sponsors around the Bible. They read passages. They talked about how they understood that in relationship to their everyday life. That's didache at its best. And then they were always, for all 3 of those years, before they were baptized, they were invited to serve the poor. They were invited to live as Christian witness in the world before they even got to the font. So becoming a Christian in the 3rd century required a serious commitment, and it promised some pretty meaningful, life-changing results. It promised eternal life. and people experienced a glimpse of that as they journeyed through the catechumenate. You knew you were learning in this process, and you knew you were growing, and you knew you were becoming more fluent in what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ, because every milestone or every threshold toward baptism was celebrated in that assembly among those worshiping members of that faith tradition, that Christian church. And you celebrated by marking your progression. The catechumenate was and is a 4-stage mentored process by which you reflected on your lived experience. You reflected on your lived experience of liturgy, worship, of lectionary Bible, and life. You put it all together all the time in a reflective, engaged manner. So another way of saying that is you lived and reflected on worship, on word, and walk. A congregation that lives the catechumenate and cultivates a climate of this kind of discernment and prayer in which people of all ages are supported as they claim their Christian vocations and align their lives with God is a congregation that truly understands the language of faith. Much like a chiropractor is trained to realign our bodies and to help a person become healthy and vital, congregations that practice this kind of ecological whole system formation that's rooted in their tradition and their worship, they raise up Christians. They raise up young people who flourish. They bring thirsty seekers to living water. And people of all ages discover their belovedness as children of God. While it's less common for congregations today to practice the traditional catechumenate, some do, what I am finding is that many more are actually living what I would call a catechumenal metabolism than even realize it. They're not using fancy Greek terms. They're not talking about the 4 stages of the catechumenate. But what they are doing is they are beginning to recognize that when someone comes into their midst as a visitor and brings deep, piercing questions, it is an invitation for that community to notice that God is moving in their midst in new ways. It's an opportunity for the newcomer to be an invitation for us to grow deeper. They actually are congregations where prayer and wrestling with the harder questions of faith are right on the surface. They're congregations where anxiety is low, where lay people lead, where laughter and joy and tears flow freely, and where I see and you would see that the gospel is being practiced and lived. They're congregations that can't stay in their building because they're excited about who they are. They know their neighborhood. They want to be in relationship with people nearby. And it is in those loving, forgiving, and joyful communities that people of all ages and all abilities are being accompanied faithfully from their earliest moment of inquiry through a process of formation, through the waters of baptism into baptismal living. It doesn't end once wet. You start to learn how to live in the world wet. At All Saints Episcopal Church in New Albany, Ohio, Michael, who just recently joined the church, was asked, "So why do you come to church? Lots of people don't choose that. Why do you bother?" And without hesitation, what Michael said was, he said, "Because I learn something every time I come to church about God and about my faith." And he said, and this is the kicker, at 82, this is the only place that believes I can still learn. I believe that you and I are here this week because each of us believes that we can still learn. We are here to reimagine how our earnest, faithful, and religious communities can make the wisdom of our theological traditions more accessible and more compelling. We're here so that people of all ages and all backgrounds and all abilities will experience the good news of Jesus Christ in language and form that gives their lives and their children's lives and their children's children's lives meaning and purpose. To accomplish that, though, we must be fluent in the language of faith formation. As the popular organizational consultant Simon Sinek says, always begin with the why. Communicate from the inside out. If we are incarnate people, and we are, made in the image of God, if you teach who you are by how you live, why does being a Christian matter to you? Why does your congregation exist? How are you actually practicing your faith? How is your congregation teaching the faith through its practices? And what then is your language of faith? Let me end with a story about a worshiping community in the Methow Valley of eastern Washington state. I think it's a story of hope and an example of speaking the language of faith and faith formation authentically in one particular context, and fluently lifelong, life-wide, and life-deep. The Methow Episcopal began when one couple moved from Seattle to the eastern side of the state, and they could not find what they longed for. They were looking for a welcoming congregation that welcomed space for hard theological questions. They found a lot of churches that were very certain about what they believed, but they couldn't find a church that welcomed the uncertain. And so they purchased a dozen or so books of common prayer, which is the Episcopal worship book, and they invited neighbors and friends to their living room, and they just began to meet regularly for prayer and conversation. Their first service was held on Ash Wednesday in 2015 in Mazama in eastern Washington, using ashes from the Methow trail pit along the way. Children were always welcome. The group moved to each other's houses as their group expanded, and they moved into the houses of anyone who wanted to worship and who for some reason was homebound. They went where people were, and they kept getting together. Anyone who volunteered from the very beginning was encouraged to participate and share in the leadership. So reading scripture, leading prayers, leading music, preparing food, maintaining the email list. Nobody asked, it just started to happen. Somebody started a Facebook group. Somebody started a website. They stopped meeting the very first summer because that couple that had started this group went out of town for 2.5 months, but they naturally started up again in August. And now, guess what? They are entering into their 4th year as a thriving, lay-led congregation of Christians. They are fiercely lay-led. In fact, it's been very funny. If you know anything about Episcopal polity, the bishop has had a little sort of work to do here to sort of figure out, are you Episcopalian? How do you relate to me? And what they've come to is this beautiful relationship that Methow Episcopal does not call itself a church, it calls itself a fellowship. And in the bishop's records, it's a bishop's chapel. So she makes visits once a year, just as she does to all of her congregations. She prays with them. If any of them want to be confirmed, in our tradition, bishops confirm, she confirms. And she is just blessing them to be who they are. They do not want clergy. They're not anti-clergy, but they do not want clergy to come in and take over. They're very happy, thank you, listening to God, where they are and how they are. Now, that being said, they also are deeply dedicated to growing deeply spiritually and growing in terms of their invitation to others. They're 100% financially independent. They raise money for what are very minimal administrative overhead expenses and for a significant amount of outreach from an all-age apple-picking, apple-pressing, cider-making tradition on one of their members' farms. There are just pictures on their website of gallons of apple cider. And they do this together with little people and larger people and older people. The priority of this group, though, is always to gather for worship in community every Sunday at 5 p.m., to reflect on Scripture, to pray for the needs of the world, in order that they can be witnesses of Christ's love in their daily lives. And over time, somebody began a children's program at 4 o'clock, and somebody else began a youth group. And now there's a really robust adult education program because someone moved into the valley with a PhD in Christian theology and wanted to lead adult classes. Chris Decatur, one of my students at Virginia Seminary, is a catechist in the Baptized for Life initiative that I'm leading, and he's the catechist assigned to the Methow Episcopal community in eastern Washington. And he was preaching there, this picture that was up that had them in a barn, he was preaching on a Sunday evening on baptism, because that's what they asked him to do, having spent the weekend with him. And in the car on the way home from that service, the twin boys in the back seat said to Chris, "So what does it mean to be baptized for life? We're not baptized, but how can we be part of this?" Echoes of the Ethiopian eunuch there for anyone? His mother, their mother, quickly, who's been an active member of this community, this fellowship for a while, told Chris that that was the first time that her 11-year-old boys had ever voiced such curiosity. So now, as is their instinct, Metau Episcopal are wrapping themselves around these two boys and preparing them for baptism at Easter. Metau Episcopal has a catechumenal metabolism. They don't know that word. I mean, they do, maybe. I don't mean to diminish their knowledge base, but they don't care if they know that word. The real issue is they understood that the thirst of seekers of all ages regularly becomes an invitation for deeper formation and for the ongoing conversion of hearts and minds. Here, they know that faith is the quality of living that makes it possible to fully live. Faith is the quality of living that makes it possible to fully live. So the language of faith that is spoken by Metau members and visitors is authentic, it's bold, it's sometimes sassy, it's willing to critique the tradition, but it is genuine. And their enthusiasm, their entheos, their in-godness, right? Their enthusiasm for living as Christian disciples is palpable and compelling because, I believe, their thirst is being quenched by living water. Ho, everyone who thirsts, come to the water.